While tariffs have been dominating the headlines these past few months, something else happened of great significance to the forest economy. Trump opened up many of America's national forests to logging. Now, the reasoning, as stated in the executive order, is both economic and silvicultural, citing concerns about forest fires. I don't want to talk about either of those things, as they would require a fairly nuanced conversation about species, forest types, fire regimes, and of course the often tricky economics of the timber industry. But a nuanced conversation around stuff Trump does is not something we're capable of having. I also don't think it's that important. So instead, I want to talk about the very economics of conservation itself. And this is something directly applicable to you and your land. What we need to recognize is that conservation on national forests in the form of decreasing or prohibiting timber harvests has failed totally and unequivocally. It has failed. The results have been a disaster for all forests, and there's no better example of this than what can be seen in the infamous spotted owl controversy. Now, to make a long story short, back in the early 90s, environmental groups sued the Forest Service to halt timber harvesting on forest lands in the Pacific Northwest under the guise of protecting the endangered spotted owl. As a result, timber harvesting was halted on 80% of national forests in the region. So let's give a big round of applause to the conservationists who succeeded in saving America's forests and the spotted owl. Or at least they would have had we not continued to consume lumber at increasing rates because, we need houses. Nothing about saving the spotted owl changed that fact, so all that happened was private land was put under increasing economic pressure to produce the lumber we need, and this was the result. This is a checkerboard of federal and private land ownership in Oregon in 1985, and here's the same area today. The wood had to come from somewhere, so private land just picked up the slack and got hammered. So instead of having harvest pressures more evenly distributed, they were just concentrated onto a smaller area. And the result was not a healthy and diverse distribution of forest types and age classes, but instead a total bifurcation of forest types. In conservation, this problem is known as leakage, the idea that preventing degradation in one area just causes it to migrate elsewhere. And it's a pretty damn hard problem to fix. You might even call it an existential problem to the entire environmentalist ideology. After all, did preventing the Cuyahoga River from burning really matter if all the manufacturing just went to Beijing and Mumbai to pollute those rivers instead? In this case, the result is even more egregious and inexcusable because it literally just migrated to the next parcel a few thousand feet away. Now you might say that this could still be justified if we saved the spotted owl. So, did we? No. Between 1995 and 2018, the population decreased by at least 65%. And according to the Audubon Society, speaking on recent studies, in some places where the owls used to number in the hundreds, researchers could only find a single bird, if any. And now conservationists have resorted to shooting the competing barred owl to try to reduce their populations, which are showing up in greater numbers. And frankly, I think it's entirely possible that the fragmentation and bifurcation of northwestern forests that spotted owl conservation resulted in may have played a role in favoring the barred owl. But we can't talk about that because the sunk cost fallacy is a thing. But anyway, I'm focusing on the Pacific Northwest because it is a convenient microcosm of this whole issue. But of course, it really is a macroeconomic question across all forest land. Where do we get our wood supply, and what is a better model for forestry? Do we want to have lighter harvesting as a percentage across all of America's forests, or do we want a more bifurcated model where some land is off limits and some land is tortured for toothpicks? Now, obviously these things work organically through price signals and hundreds of thousands of private decisions, but let's just pretend we're a Soviet economy because the question is the same and it's easier to conceptualize. We have 100 units of forest and we need to produce 100 units of lumber for homes. How much forest should we conserve? Maybe we can conserve 75 units of forests. Can the remaining 25 units of forest supply all 100 units of lumber? Maybe, but we definitely need to plant and manage it in an intensive fashion to quadruple production relative to the baseline. That will piss people off and people will complain about it, but at least 75 units are untouched, and we should then be grateful for the sacrificial lamb of the 25 units reserved for harvesting. Or maybe we can do half and half. We can have more naturalistic management, but half of forests are still going to look pretty ravaged. Maybe 25% conservation. Now we're at a number that a lot of people would probably say is reasonable, and to be clear, the executive order only opened up 60% of national forests to logging and increases harvests by a modest 25%. But more to the point, consider the radical view that conserved forests are close to 0%. To a lot of you, if I said we should conserve no forests, you would immediately think that all forests would be clear-cut. But if we had all forests available in the pool of timber production, forestry looks a lot like harvesting natural mortality and following the natural dynamics of a forest than it does actively and intensively managing one. In such a world, the economics would probably favor longer rotation ages as the entire industry would tool themselves for larger diameter trees because, trust me when I say, absolutely no one wants to deal with small timber if they don't have to. You can see parallels in other commodity markets. You only develop bituminous sand if there isn't enough sweet Saudi crude to go around. An increase in supply favors higher grades, which in forestry means larger diameters and older forests. And so there's an argument to be made that low levels of conservation can conserve more overall as long as the forests are still reserved for timber production after harvest. Now, your reaction to that, I think, depends on whether you think any level of interference in an old-growth ecosystem ruins its ecological value, even, for example, a 15% removal group selection every half century or something of the sort, something very scientifically aligned with natural stand dynamics. We aren't necessarily talking about old growth, of course, but being extreme helps cut to the heart of the issue. What I want conservationists to understand is that you guys are economists, or at least economizers. You ascribe values to things, and shooting barred owls to save spotted owls is a great example of that. Maybe it's justified, sure, but you are necessarily placing differing values on those two species. And what determines those values? I'm sure you'd say science, but I don't think that's possible. I think it's way more arbitrary. And that's a real question. That's what I think people need to reflect on. When you say that there's no level of intervention in old growth stands that can be done in an ecologically sound way, the valuation placed on that quote untouched ecosystem in that particular state is so high it transcends science. There is nothing measurable that can justify that valuation. It approaches mysticism, and if we're being honest, there's a real intersection between ecology types and mycology types. And that is a very big problem if the field and its efforts are to be taken seriously, and I say that out of love. But if you do understand and acknowledge that these things exist on a curve, then we should have a real conversation about that. Now, this isn't a small issue because state and federal forests together represent 40% of all forest land in the US, and I'd guess most of that is close to harvesting. But there's another point that I really want my viewers to understand here. Who owns the remaining 60% of forests? Is it large corporate landowners like Weyerhaeuser, whose ownership literally changes millions of times a minute on the stock exchange? No, that's only 20%. The rest of the 40% of land, a proportion equal to government ownership, belongs to you, small landowners with an average parcel size of 60 acres. You are America's forests. How are you managing them? Your choices matter. Everything I've said here about the failures of conservation on public land also hold true to small landowners and how they manage their forest. Do not think for a moment that what you do doesn't matter in the scheme of things. It does. And we do have a collective responsibility as landowners to manage our forests and to harvest from them when appropriate. That's why I call my business Silvicultural a syndicate, because we are collectively America's largest cohort of landowners. We are forestry and America's forests, and we can be much better. I get a lot of comments from people essentially saying that they wouldn't harvest on their land or manage it in any way unless they made a lot of money from it. That makes me sad. When I harvested my land a couple years ago, I targeted almost exclusively trees that were going to die in the next decade. And on a very small harvest that was like 5 acres, I calculated my friend and I cut enough wood to provide the framing lumber for 2 medium-sized homes. 50 cords if you want to challenge me on that. That's pretty amazing. When I was a forester, I think my biggest harvest block was like 500 acres. And yet I never once received the level of satisfaction that I got harvesting those 5 acres. Because those 5 acres were mine. Those 2 houses were my contribution to humanity. When you're a forester working for another landowner that's actively managing their land, you're an intermediary. It will happen with or without you. But when you own land yourself and say, hey, listen, these trees are going to die. Let's use them for something useful, and that way we don't have to enter forests that can be left to grow. To me, that's real stewardship, real management, and real conservation, and it isn't something that happens on its own. And it's why I really do what I do. So thank you so much to those who watched to the end. Most won't, and so I know this is going to be a fun comment section. And I know someone is going to say something about hemp, potentially a lot of people, depending on how many views I get. That's not real. It was never real. I've been hearing people talk endlessly about hemp buildings for over a decade, and there are less than 100 hemp homes in the US. Why? Because it's stupid. I'm not going to elaborate on that. If you want to build with hemp, do it. You won't. So let's have a real conversation about forests and how we harvest the wood that we need. All right, that's all. If you hear this and are now inspired to begin managing your own land, don't forget you can grab How to Read Your Forest, which can give you an introduction to forestry, silviculture, and land stewardship. And of course, you can join Silvicultural and get access to our mapping program, sustainable harvesting tools, Forester AI, and more. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who has joined so far. You are really why I've been able to bring this as far as I have, because development is expensive, but thanks to you guys, we've been releasing new features consistently and have so much more functionality coming. Next week, I'll be releasing an inventory management system so you can actually conduct cruises and see how much wood you have by species and stand. That's something I've wanted to release since I first launched in August. I think I actually mentioned it in the initial release video, but it's a big project, takes time, takes money, and we've had some technical issues along the way. But we are here. So really, thank you guys so much, and I'm excited to release it and provide you guys with that. So until next time, later.